November morning. It's October still, right?
Yeah.
I'm rushing myself. I'm thinking primary already. My name's John Clayton. I'm the Executive Director of the Manchester Historic Association and Millyard Museum. And thank you for joining us for this, our tour of the Amoskeag Millyard. This is not just going to be a backward-looking tour. There's so much happening in the Millyard today. We need to incorporate items of the present and the future. So you might get some opportunities today you would not have got otherwise. In terms of housekeeping, you know we are a member-supported organization. We don't get any city, state, or federal funding. And I'm going to ask Gail York, one of our board members, to hold up a membership brochure. You could have saved, if you paid $10 for the tour, you could have saved yourself $5 off the bat just by becoming a member of the Manchester Historic Association. Annual memberships are as little as $25 a year, depending upon your age. And as I look around, most of you would qualify for that $25 rate. So take advantage and become a member. Some housekeeping details. We've got a lot going on this month. In addition to this, our walking tour on Saturday and Sunday of next week, we're going to open the Western Observatory for foliage viewing. It's a fundraiser for the museum, so there will be a charge. If you have an issue with that, call your alderman today and tell them you don't want to pay to go up in the Western Observatory. It's not going to get you up anyway, but at least you'll feel good because you beefed at your alderman, which is always fun to do. So that's the 12th and the 13th. On the 24th, we are hosting a craft beer tasting here at the Millyard Museum. That's a Thursday night from 5 to 7:30. We've got 8 of the local brewers helping us out. And if you don't like beer, we have Martin Yeti Companies with wine and Ancient Fire Mead and Cider. They produce mead and cider right here in Manchester, and they have a special Millyard brew. So join us on the 24th. And on the 26th, we are having a Civil War reenactment at Victory Park, right in front of the City Library and right in front of our research center. So these are just a sampling of some of the events we have going on, in addition to our recently opened exhibit, Manchester and the Path to the Presidency. So when we conclude this walking tour today, you're welcome to enter the museum again, and if you want to, take time to view that exhibit and the rest of the museum. One of the difficulties in doing a walking tour of the Millyard is that it is not chronologically friendly. In our museum, we do go chronologically, 11,000 years of history in this area, but here in the Millyard, it's going to be a little bit of back and forth, so bear with me. It means you have to really pay attention because I'm going to go forward and backward in time, so don't let me lose you somewhere in the cosmos, okay? So, I said 11,000 years. That's how long people have lived in this area. The native people who came here originally came here because of what? The Merrimack River, but in particular the Amoskeag Falls. That was a body, a cork of water that the river fell 50 feet in about a quarter of a mile. And it was very dramatic during the spring freshet. That's when the snow is melting in the mountains. And we get our rainy season. You may recall 21 out of 30 days in April it rained. Thank God we get past that. So the anadromous fish that populate the Merrimack River would be spawned north of us. They would make their way to the ocean. They can live in fresh and salt water. And so when it was time for them to spawn and have their own young, that meant a journey back up the Merrimack River to the area around Franklin and Tilton. The Merrimack is formed when the Winnipesaukee and Pemigewasset rivers come together. Well, that confluence of those rivers is where those native fish would go to spawn. To do so, they had to make their way up the Amoskeag Falls. That was the greatest hurdle to getting where they wanted to be. And so they would exhaust themselves trying to swim up the falls, come to rest in the pools below, and the native people would wait on the banks and harvest the bounty of the Merrimack River. Everybody's favorite Protestant cleric, Cotton Mather, described them as the hideous falls at Amoskeag. And it was those falls, in part, that 11,000 years later prompted a bunch of wealthy Boston businessmen to say, this area will be the perfect place to create an industrial utopia where people will want to live and work around the manufacture of textiles. So they bought 15,000 acres of pristine farmland divided by this powerful river right where we are today. And their vision was to create what they called the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. The word Amoskeag from those native people means place of many fish. That's why the company adopted that name. And we're going to cover the next 175 years of history as we make our way forward. So please follow me and don't knock over Paul. He's got the camera.
Did they set a rate for next weekend? Did they set a price for
Yeah, $5 for members, $20 for families, and our going to set up here and do a little. So the reason the founders of the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company purchased all this land was because of the powerful river. Their intent was to use water power to drive the looms that would make all the fabric. At its peak, you got that? Thank you. At its, oh, that even works better when you point it the right way. At its peak, Amoskeag employed more than 17,000 people, producing more than 470 miles of fabric every day. It was an astounding creation that was born of that vision to create an industrial utopia. So they built mill number 1. And mill number 1 is quickly filled with all the farm workers here who decided to leave their farms and work in a textile mill. But the vision is to create another mill and another and another. So Amoskeag, of necessity, became pioneers in what we call today workforce development. They had to constantly find new sources of labor to come and work in these mills if they were going to fulfill that vision. And history is a series of coincidences. Around 1838, when the first mill opens to produce textiles, something was happening over in Ireland you perhaps have heard of. Some people call it the potato famine, and my family was simply called the hunger. So Irish immigrants began streaming to America to flee the hunger, and it was those unskilled Irish immigrants who came here. They're the laborers who dug the canals that would power the mills. They carved the granite to form the foundations. They laid the bricks that would become these mill buildings. So that coincidence of history was in great ways a part of Amoskeag's success going forward, because they needed labor. As you may know, at the same time that was happening, family farms in the maritime provinces of Canada were failing. It may have been a blight similar to what was happening in Ireland. The cause is not generally known. But for those family farm owners, if you went 3 years without a sustainable crop, allowed you to sell your goods to make money, you would lose your land. The Canadian government, if you didn't pay your taxes, would seize your land. Amoskeag, recognizing that that was happening, also very quickly responded by sending agents to Montreal and Quebec City by train. They would get in horse and buggies and travel through the countryside to recruit those family farmers to come and live and work here in this planned industrial utopia, with a promise of a good job, clean housing. They had set aside land for parks and churches and schools and playgrounds to make this a place where people wanted to come and live and work. You probably know that Manchester was nearly 50% French speaking at one time because of that influx of Franco-American laborers who came here. And so Amoskeag is going great guns. The building we just left was called Mill Number 3. I'll let you figure out why they came up with that very clever name. It was the third of many mills they were going to build. Ultimately, there would be 75 independent mill buildings that made up the Amoskeag Millyard. And when people think about it, and by that I mean detractors, they really didn't like these buildings, thought of them as being these red, blocky, unwieldy buildings. But Amoskeag took great pains to make this a beautiful place. So when we talk about grace notes in architecture, for example, look at the graceful curve on this building. The lintel work they took the time to create, they didn't have to do that. They could have made these square boxes that didn't really do any good. If you see those metal objects, the rosebuds on the building, those are called tie rods, and they are our masterpiece of what engineers and architects call form and function. Those are the reason these buildings will stand for another 500 years. And if you look down the building, you'll see they run almost every floor. What would happen is, as Amoskeag built these buildings, when they reached a wooden floor level, they would hammer the tie rod anchored into the floor, and then those little decorative caps would be threaded onto that, making an irrevocable bond between the floor of the building and the wall. So in Mill Number 3 alone, there were 800 operational looms. So imagine the vibrations, the motion. It was like a mini earthquake every day inside Mill Number 3. And those little grace notes, those design notes of those tie rods, are again a great reason why these buildings are so sturdy and so applicable to that kind of labor. Dean Kamen, who came here in the early 1980s, recognized those kinds of things and began buying up mills. He bought 240 Commercial Street over here, which we'll go into later, for $100,000. And then he invested over $1 million in renovating the building, with the mindset that these buildings were built to last, it's built for industry, and he benefited mightily thanks to Mayor Ray Wazorek, who many of you may have voted for at one time in your life. Mayor Wazorek realized that there were limitations that were holding the Millyard back from becoming a vital economic engine for the city that it had been so many years ago. What he did was he changed the zoning laws. Originally, the Millyard was zoned for nothing but manufacturing. And if you weren't manufacturing, you couldn't be in the Millyard. By changing the zoning laws, he allowed different types of industry to come here in the Millyard. So today we have the University of New Hampshire at Manchester in the Millyard. We have a climbing gym over in the Wambach Mill over there, which I don't think our forefathers would have thought of for one of the nice clock towers they built into the buildings. We have cotton. That's my sister-in-law's restaurant, by the way. We have the Foundry, which is Dean Kamen's restaurant. And you should know that the Foundry is what they call the machine shop that was part of the lifeblood of Amoskeag. So even as he's modernizing the Millyard, Dean is paying homage to our heritage by naming his restaurant the Foundry. So again, as we walk around, look for these little grace notes, as I call them. I don't know how important you had to be to have one of those patios coming off your office. I wouldn't recommend going onto it today since the floors are no longer there on the patio. But if you were an overseer or an agent, that might have been your office with the opportunity to step outside the building and enjoy some fresh air in the course of the workday.
John, what were years for the French Canadian immigration?
Starting in around 1840 is when it was heaviest. And again, it coincided with Amoskeag's need for more labor. So as they came here, Amoskeag built what we call the corporation. Those are all the beautiful red brick row houses on Market, Merrimack, Middle Street, Stark Street, and that was built by the corporation in the earliest days because they had to offer housing as a draw, especially for the young mill girls. We're going to meet Millie, the mill girl statue, in just a little bit. But for them to get them to leave the farm to come and live in an urban area, it was kind of scary. It was really unknown territory because no one knew what industrialization would do to the fabric of American society. So they induced these girls to come here with the promise of a clean housing place with a den mother, if you will, to look after them, to make sure that there were no alcohol, no cigarettes, no men. And that was part of the culture that they were brought here for. And the French Canadians, mostly Roman Catholic, welcomed that kind of a clean living area. So once Amoskeag finished with the corporation after the first 20 years, they decided to get out of the housing business, not build the homes anymore. So they started contracting with private developers who would build the homes. We are honoring a gentleman named Ezekiel Straw in the museum. We just reunited his portrait with that of his late wife, Charlotte Webster Straw. At an age of 18, he was asked to lay out and design this planned industrial city. So as Ezekiel Straw sat down to name the streets on the east side of the city, rather than numbering them, even though it was an orderly grid, not unlike New York City, we don't have a West 23rd Street, he named the streets after trees. So go through your mind next time you're heading east across Elm Street: Elm, Beech, Maple, Chestnut, Pine, further up Hemlock and Linden Street. So that was part of Ezekiel Straw's vision. When the Franco-Americans started coming here in greater numbers, they tended to settle on the west side of the city. When Amoskeag got out of the housing business, they hired private contractors to buy land and then build homes. Among the leading builders on the west side of Manchester, when they started building with wood frame rather than brick, was R.G. Sullivan, who owned the R.G. Sullivan Cigar Factory on Canal Street. I bet you could all pick it out. Gail and Don York are here. When that was Indian Head Shoes, that was Gail's father's company. Later Indian Head Athletics, and now the York kids own the building. It's home to GYK Antler among their other ventures and enterprises. But Mr. Sullivan was one of the prime developers of the west side of Manchester. And not unlike Ezekiel Straw, knowing that his residents were primarily going to be French speaking, in terms of naming the streets on that side of the city, go through it in your mind. Notre Dame Avenue, Cartier, Dubuque, Joliet, Laval, Alsace. Those are French-sounding names and pleasing to Franco speakers, so they felt very much at home as soon as they moved into those neighborhoods. That was part of their culture, and that was done by some businessmen with real great foresight in terms of making a community that made people feel at home. Questions?
Are there mills that have the curved top windows that were built before 1858?
They were, but there were several modifications made to many of the buildings. For instance, the first mill buildings were built with the pitched roofs. And, you know, that makes sense. We live in New Hampshire. It snows, and so a pitched roof is much safer in terms of bearing the weight of a heavy snow in the winter. But what they discovered is that in the process of manufacturing textiles, the cotton fibers they worked with tended to gravitate upward. And so they would go into the peak of the pitched roofs. And the danger of flash fires were made very readily apparent when they had a few of them. So all the buildings had to be refit with flat roofs, which, again, as from an engineering point of view, here in New Hampshire, was quite a feat to take on the weight of the snow we would get. The windows varied from building to building, but they found that the curved window, again, added to the structural integrity, not just of that window, but of the entire building, because the arch is stronger than a flat. And so as you look around here, Dean just redid 540, 560 North Commercial, and they redid every window in the building. So he appreciates the engineering value of those curves, which again may seem like a decorative touch, but it's much more form than and function than it is form.
Can you comment on how the materials were loaded and unloaded from these buildings?
Yeah, you mean how the buildings were built?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Manchester's waterway here on the Merrimack River, the sand is too fine to make bricks. And part of that was because of the pulverizing effect of the Amoskeag Falls. As the sand came down, it was just too powdery. Hooksett is blessed with clay beds that run throughout the community. So the bricks for these buildings were almost universally made in Hooksett. And my Hooksett friends remind me of that every day. If it weren't for us, your office would be on the street because there would be no mill building. So know that. In terms of quantity and the vast number of bricks that were used, the Jefferson Mill building with the beautiful clock tower has more than 8 million bricks in that one building alone. So someday we're going to get together a pool of volunteers, when you retire, and we're going to count every brick in the Millyard, and the number, I promise you, will be astounding. And if you want to see it in miniature, our friends at the Sea Science Center on the 4th floor of our building, that's the home of the largest single permanent Lego display in the world. And it's a recreation of the Millyard and other elements from the city of Manchester. So if you've never been to our friends at the Sea Science Center, you should definitely go up, especially get the perspective after this walking tour, because you'll see it in miniature as opposed to seeing it in all of its real-life grandeur. Can we move on? I'll ask questions as we go.
Were these roads all canals before?
The canals, and people still look at me like I've got 3 heads when I talk about the canals. Until the urban renewal movement from 68 to 72, Commercial Street was the lower canal, here, right here. Bedford Street was the upper canal. Canal Street was not the canal. That's a very common misperception. Canal Street was so named because it ran parallel to the canal that today is Bedford Street. When you come into the museum, we demonstrate the penstocks. Those were the pipe vessels that brought the water into the museums to power the looms. So the Millyard you see is built on a gradual downslope to the river. So by channeling water into the upper canal, which is now Bedford Street, the sheer force of gravity would draw it into the building through the penstock, which would then hit a blade turbine, which would spin, and through a series of interconnected cogs and belts, that would drive all the 800 looms in this one building. When it was done with its work there, it would discharge into what is now Commercial Street, the lower canal, gravity taking it into the buildings on the face of the river, and it would then power those looms and discharge right back. The next time you drive on the Everett Turnpike, look back toward the Millyard, and if the river's low, as it is now, you'll see the arcs where the penstocks emptied back into the river. It's a pretty amazing feat of foresight for them to install that kind of infrastructure before the mills were built. So the waterworks were put in place. This is a retaining wall from the lower canal, from Commercial Street. That was actually here right flush against these buildings. So it was an era where there were no automobiles, so there was no need to build roads in the Millyard. So the canals, they were not used for transportation, not the industrial canals. They were used simply for water power, but train lines would run through here. But again, 1831, there were no autos, so there was no need for roads. So part of urban renewal was to make this suitable for manufacturing in the 20th century. So roads were added, and the canals sadly were lost. I would love to be able to take tourists and put them in little boats and let them go up and down the canals, but that was the price of progress. We should be happy we have what we have here in the Millyard, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So we move on. Yeah, the Millyard was actually an island. You had to cross a bridge to come into the Millyard because that was part of Amoskeag's practice of keeping non-workers out. You couldn't unionize if you couldn't get in the Millyard, so you had to show your papers. But yeah, bridges crossed every canal at multiple points here. So we were almost like a mini Venice. And if you come into the Millyard, we'll show you that they dug the canals and then transported the materials onto what became an island to actually construct the mills there, here in the center part of the Millyard.
John, were the West Side mills powered by water?
The West Side mills were powered by steam. And that was obviously much later as the technology changed. For example, again, in the museum, I'll show you where Arms Textile used to be, right on the face of the river where the Riverwalk is today. Well, that was there until 1977. But they used to burn coal in Arms Textile on this side of the river, and they had a steam pipe bridge that actually went across to the west side. So the power that was produced here on this side by burning steam is what powered those looms on the west side of the river. Okay, let's move on just so we don't get stuck.
Carry it then. I'll pick it up the next
I
stop.
appreciate you doing it. You're turning it the right way. That's me. Turn it down. So these are some.
Where was the Pandora sweater factory?
At the very end, see the tower?
Yes.
That was Pandora. It's now the home of UNH Manchester. And they were We good? Everybody with us? We haven't lost anybody yet, right? Okay, I didn't hear any sirens or see any police flashers, so I guess we're good. So we are here at what is classically known as Millie, the Mill Girl statue, which is a sculptor that pays homage to those single French-Canadian women who came to live here in Manchester working in the textile mills. She was installed in 1988. And if you look at this plaza, you'll see it's in something of disrepair. I'm part of a group called Manchester Connects. It's a volunteer group trying to do things for the city that the city won't do for itself. So our latest project will be to help renovate and redesign this plaza, making it handicapped accessible. It is not right now, which is a cardinal sin. So we're working with the city on this design, and don't worry, the hot dog guy will still be here, okay? Mark Doobie's a good friend, and we don't want to put him out of business. But again, when you talk about the different elements of the building, you can see those lintels I was talking about with the brickwork, efforts made to make the buildings beautiful as well as functional. The key event in the history of Amoskeag, we talk about the founding in 1831, but the ultimate demise of Amoskeag is equally important, and that took place in 1936. Amoskeag had gone through some dwindling economic fortunes in the early 1900s. The first general strike at Amoskeag was in 1922. That lasted for 9 months, and more than $50 million in productivity was lost in that time because Amoskeag's business model had started to falter. When they started burning coal to generate steam here in the Northeast, they also were able to do the same thing in the American South. So now the reason we were predominant in the Northeast in the textile industry was because of our powerful rivers. Well, now that advantage is being negated by the ability to burn coal to generate steam. So textile mills started cropping up in the American South. Amoskeag's business model depended upon cotton that was harvested in the beginning by slaves on southern plantations. Again, we're talking 1831. So up through the Civil War, that was where the cotton was coming from. But now we're into almost the early 1900s. The cotton is being grown right outside the mills in the South. So how much more economical was it to start making textiles there rather than giving the cotton a 1,000-mile train ride to Manchester to be turned into cloth and then go back? I should point out, it's cold weather. I'm not wearing jeans, but many of you are. The denim for the first Levi's ever made was made right here at Amoskeag. They had a contract with the Levi Strauss Company, and when the gold rush started in 1849, you all know that's why that San Francisco football team is called the 49ers, right? Men were going into the gold mines in gabardine slacks and coming out half naked by the end of their shift in the mills. Their clothes would get shredded. So Levi Strauss needed some durable fabrics that the men could wear going into the mines, and that's why the first denim ever made here was shipped out to California to be made into the first Levi's. But the business model, again, was not working into the early 1900s. So Amoskeag was trying to come up with new business models, new manufacturing techniques that would streamline their costs. And then, and again, another coincidence of history, the Great War began in 1914. Amoskeag was flooded with federal contracts from the Canadian government to make uniforms for the Canadian soldiers. We were not yet in the war until 1916, but when that happened, again, federal money to make uniforms for the American soldiers was flooding into Manchester. We just had a new book that was written by 2 UNH professors on Manchester shoe industry. Most people don't know, but for the Great War, almost every boot made for the Russian military was made in Manchester. So that was a huge influx of cash coming into Manchester. People got fat and happy, and they started to forget about the fact that we were in some economic trouble because of Amoskegg's business model. So the war ends in 1918, all that federal money stops. Amoskeg is in real deep financial trouble. They struggled to get along, they waited a few years, but finally in 1922, the workers were told, 17,000 workers, that your pay is being cut 20%. And your work week is going from 48 hours to 54 hours a week. Amoskeg had been considered a strikeless company. Number of reasons. So many languages were spoken in the Millyard. It was hard for the unions to get traction. But also Amoskeg was very benevolent to their employees. They worked under what they called a practice of corporate paternalism, by which they provided things for the workers so they didn't need unions to acquire them for them. Like what? Well, they built Textile Field, now Gill Stadium, as a venue for sporting events and entertainment, track meets. The world champion Boston Red Sox played the first game at Textile Field in 1913 against a team of Manchester All-Stars. The only time I would have been rooting against the Red Sox, they won, 3-1. But the Manchester boys did themselves proud. They had a theater company, so if you wanted to act, you could act. They had a camera club. They provided land for gardens, so if you wanted to grow your own produce, you could do that. They had nutrition classes to teach mothers how to make wholesome meals for their kids. So Amoskeg looked after all of those needs until the economics got in the way, and that was in 1922. So the vote to go on strike was overwhelming. The strike lasted 9 months. I mentioned $50 million was lost. The biggest thing that was lost was a sense of trust. The workers believed that Amoskeg had their best interests at heart, and they did until economics got in the way. So with that sense of trust lost, Amoskeg's business fortunes continued to plummet, and there was a second general strike in 1933. Finally, on Christmas Eve in 1935, not good timing, Amoskeg filed for bankruptcy protection. That meant they wanted to try to reorganize, to go to New York, get some more financing, but 3 months later, in March of 1936, the biggest flood ever to come roaring down the Merrimack River blew Manchester in two. It took out every bridge, and you will see some vestiges of those bridges that were lost. So any hope Amoskeg had of reopening was gone. They filed for complete bankruptcy, and here sits Manchester on the verge of what they called economic ruination. When I talk about the flood, if you look to the building to the right behind the Decca parking only sign on the wall, you see that white square next to the green converter box. That is the high water mark of the flood. The flood was 17 feet over the dam at Amoskeg's hydro plant. It came all the way up here into the lower canal, so that everything you see beyond that was underwater. So all the buildings on the face of the river were underwater to the second floor. The water didn't recede for 5 days. All of the heaviest equipment tended to be on the lower floors. So the people at Amoskeg knew that any hope they had of reopening was gone. So they filed for full bankruptcy. And now we're going to make our way down there and see some of the vestiges of the flood and talk more about how that devastation changed the shape of Manchester for years to come.
How did the people survive for 9 months with no income?
The question is, how did people survive for 9 months with no income? The union helped when it could. There was relief, which was not government aid, because if you were on strike, you weren't going to get aid from the government. So the mill workers got together. They had what they called tag days. They would literally stand on street corners like anybody play Little League and do tag day, when you get a little tag and you tie it on your jacket so all the other kids knew not to hit on you because you already gave money. Well, that's how the workers would do that. They would sell tags. Because if you think of it, 17,000 people out of work in a city of about 40,000. So if you didn't work at Amoskeg, everybody else in town depended upon your Amoskeg paycheck. If you ran a butcher shop or a dress shop, your customers are now out of work. So it was scrimp and save and frugal Yankees finding ways to get by. Eating beans. That's when maybe the Saturday bean supper and hot dogs came into vogue. So it was just whatever you could do to get by. Take on part-time work, take on labor, mowing lawns, whatever you could do. It was a very, very difficult time for Manchester.
17,000 workers, how many
The ratio of men to women was pretty close, because most of the women worked in the jobs involved in manufacturing of textiles. Men worked in the foundry, they worked in the machine shop, they operated the machinery, so the division of labor was partly due to the division of the sexes. The lighter work would be done by the women, the men would do the heavier labor. And what was the second part?
How
Yeah, they were paid differently. Higher skill sets were certainly paid more. Part of Amoskegg's immigration history, this is a good jumping off point for me, after that initial wave when they simply needed bodies to work in the mills, it became about specific skill sets. So the machine shop was imperative for Amoskeg to run because there was so much equipment in these buildings, so they needed to get the finest machinists they could to come and live and work in Manchester. At that time, 1830, 1840, the most skilled engineers and machinists in the world were in Germany. So Amoskeg sent agents to Germany to recruit those people to come here and work in the foundry, and that's why on the west side of Manchester, people tend to think of it as a monolithic Franco-American community. It really wasn't. More to the northwest, but in the center, around what is called Scrog, Granite Square, that was a large Germanic community. We had Sconland's hot dogs. The sausage makers came here from Germany. The beer makers came here from Germany as well. So we had a thriving German community. And then as the fabrics changed, they went from that heavy denim, they started making gingham dresses for women. They got very involved in the New York fashion industry. They had a sales force of 90 men, and they were all men working in New York with the garment industry. So they started making finer dresses. Women didn't want to wear black and gray after 1890, so they started making gingham dresses, which required very bright colors. They needed people who knew how to dye the fabrics to make those colors. So they started bringing in people from Great Britain and Scotland who were skilled in the textile industry, more so than we were. So Manchester suddenly has a very vibrant Scottish and British community. And then, someone said Amoskeg was a successful company because of the fickle nature of women. I did not say that. And what did they mean by that? They meant that women changed their wants when the fashion industry changed. So all of a sudden they wanted gingham dresses. Amoskeg responded, with product line that met that need. Now the women want lace collars on those fancy gingham dresses. The best lace makers in the world were in Belgium. So Amoskeg duly responds and sent agents to Belgium to come here to make lace. And Swedish lace makers were also very much in demand. So part of Manchester's ethnic diversity is because of Amoskeg. They had these skills they needed to meet, and so they went and got the people where they were and brought them here to Manchester. So when we get down to the river, you get full proof of that. The street on the river is called Mungal Street, M-U-N-G-A-L-L. The first Scotsman to come from Manchester with his dye recipes was Andrew Mungal, and that street is named in his honor. So let's make our way down toward the river. And the sun.
Were those bridge abutments that we're going to see with the theater with your sets? Those both from the third? Okay.
And we talked about the lingering effects of the flood of 1936. What you see behind us here to the north, those stanchions are what held up the steam pipe bridge that used to originate here. Where we are right now was Arms Textile until 1977. So being a good West Side boy, when I would drive across the river or walk or ride my bike, the mill was right on the face of the river. This river walk did not exist, so it was flush with the river. So they would burn the coal on this side of the river and it would be transported by the steam pipe across to the mills on the west side. The mills on the west side, the closest ones to the river, were lost when the Everett Turnpike was built in the late 1950s. And that's a fascinating story by itself. The highway commissioner for the state of New Hampshire was a gentleman named Frank D. Merrill. He was famous for leading an engineering battalion during World War II called Merrill's Marauders. So when you drive to Merrimack on the Everett Turnpike, you will see a sign honoring the Merrill's Marauders. They were subject of a great movie. Jeffrey Chandler, all you movie buffs, played General Frank D. Merrill, who actually suffered 2 heart attacks in the jungles of China and Burma while they were building roads for the American troops fighting against the Japanese. So General Merrill always told people, when we built roads in the jungle, we built them along the rivers. That was the easiest way to do it. So when he came back home to New Hampshire, he was from Conway, he actually decided to do the same thing here in New Hampshire. So he built the Everett Turnpike right along the river, which sadly robbed us of any recreational opportunities to use the river for that purpose. But that was his way, and that's what he did. Now the the lower stanchions to the south, that was a pedestrian bridge for the mill workers, and by building that, Amoskeag saved those West Siders the trouble of walking all the way up to what was then the McGregor Bridge. This is before the Notre Dame Bridge, you may remember. That was built in 1936 after the flood, but the original bridge would be quite a hike for those mill workers. Oh, we're beeping, Christy. I think that means we're going to let me know and I'll shout louder. So the pedestrian bridge saved them a long walk to cross the river here. It would land right at what is now Foundry Street. So if you were to cross that bridge, you'd come up right now looking at Catholic Medical Center. And for all of those West Side mill workers, that put them right in the heart of what used to be called the Flatiron District. Urban renewal, you're going to hear me use that phrase about 100 more times, took away the Flatiron District. It was a residential area filled with tenements, and for those of us who grew up on the west side, we would tell people we had no reason to cross the bridge to come to downtown Manchester. We had everything we needed on the west side. Dress shops, butcher shops, grocery stores, everything was right there. So that was part of the culture in which I grew up. Silvio Dupri is a great ambassador for that great old neighborhood. We had movie theaters, we had the Modern, we had the Granite Street Theater, so that was just part of the life in Manchester where the two parts of the city were equally self-sufficient. So that allowed you to get across the river and make your way right up to maybe St. Mary's Bank. Why would the mill workers from the west side want to go to St. Mary's Bank? Back in the early days of the mills, payday was Thursday, and you didn't get a check. You got a pay packet, which had cash in it. So these mill workers wouldn't go up to the banks on Elm Street because they only spoke English. And they didn't trust their money to guys or men or women who didn't speak their language. So they would take their pay packet home with them. And what would they do with it? Before St. Mary's, under the mattress, in the cookie jar. A series of tenement fires on the west side of Manchester would devastate 3 entire families. First floor, second floor, third floor. The parish priest at St. Mary's was Monsignor Pierre Heavey, who was a zealot when it came time to taking care of his flock. So recognizing this economic dilemma that was affecting so many of the people in his parish, he had heard about a movement that was taking place in Canada called La Caisse Populaire, the People's Bank. So he reached out to a gentleman named Alphonse Desjardins, who was one of the leaders of that People's Bank, and asked him to come to Manchester and speak to his flock at St. Mary's Church. So he came here in 1906, spoke to the entire parish, asked them to sign petitions to bring the People's Bank to New Hampshire. That was filed with the New Hampshire Banking Commission, so they took the application, went to Concord, and St. Mary's Bank, La Caisse Populaire St. Marie, became the first credit union in America, created specifically to serve those mill workers who needed that kind of economic help, all thanks to Monsignor Heavey. So that was 1908, 2008, they celebrated their 100th anniversary, and guess who got to be the spokesman for St. Mary's Bank? An Irish kid named Clayton, who was a third-generation member. My mom and dad were members, my grandparents were members. My grandfather's original name was Belfay, which means pretty leaf in French. They anglicized it to Leaf. So I still walk the streets of Manchester and people will come up to me and say, "You're a Leaf, aren't you?" And some people don't know what they mean, others do. So that was one of Monsignor Heavey's gifts to his French-speaking population. Notre Dame Hospital was also founded by Monsignor Pierre Heavey. He is, again, in the same way his parishioners were afraid of dealing with English-speaking bankers, imagine going to the hospital and not being able to speak the same language as the doctors and nurses who are providing you with care. So he created Notre Dame Hospital. He reached out to the Sisters of St. Hyacinth in Quebec. They came and they were the nurses who tended to the flock. He brought French-speaking doctors here. And that was just part of the vision of Monsignor Heavey. He also created St. Peter's Orphanage because, you know, this is an industrial city. People died horrible deaths in the mills and left children behind. So by creating the orphanage, he made sure that another generation of French-speaking kids would be looked after. Later on, it would become a more traditional orphanage, but in the beginning, it was designed to serve those kids. So this is Monsignor Heavey. He is recognized in the beautiful plaza at St. Mary's Church, which, if you read the paper, you know just became listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Not just the church, but the entire campus around it. The rectory, the old elementary school, the high school, which is a great tribute. And now we're trying to get a larger cultural district recognized on the west side that would also incorporate St. Mary's Bank and what is now Catholic Medical Center, all part of the vision of Monsignor Heavey, which a century later is still a vital part of Manchester. So keep an eye on that progress as we go forward. When you go over there and you stand on the plaza at St. Mary's facing this way, look to your right near the Notre Dame Church and you'll see a bust of Monsignor Heavey. It's not just a bust, it's his headstone. He chose to be buried on the grounds of Notre Dame Hospital. He felt that was his most notable gift or achievement for his flock. So it's a beautiful bust on a plinth, and it's actually his burial site. So as we go forward, moving with this historic district, someone said, can we reinter his body and have it buried somewhere else in that area? That was not his wish. His wish was to be buried there. And so we will honor that wish. Questions?
Yes.
Pardon me? I don't. Constant color. Never changes.
You spoke of tenement fires. So many mills in New England have burned down. How about fire here at the mills?
I mentioned earlier that when they first built them with the peaked roofs, there were some flash fires that went through, but Amoskeag made quick efforts to stop that. In the town of Lowell, we actually did a field trip with our museum group last year. One of the worst disasters ever was the Pemberton Mill fire in Lowell. What they did is, rather than using wood for framing for the buildings like we do, you see all that incredible oak that's built into these buildings, they were using pre-manufactured hollow metal columns to support the building at the Pemberton Mill. So these were manufactured in England and shipped here, and in that case it was a layered building, 5 layers. One of the hollow beams shattered, and the weight of the building coming down, it pancaked. So 5 floors, while the mill was operational, at least 500 people died, but that, talk about rubbing salt in the wound. So the mill collapses and everybody's just like the World Trade Center. Boom, boom, boom. Everybody's trapped in the building. The rescue people, as it got dark, were trying to find and save people with lamps. Somebody knocked over a lantern. The entire structure went up in flames. So people died horrible deaths in the mill because of that. For that was a lesson for Amoskeag, but it's a lesson they'd learned before. Their preemptive measures to use wood for beams rather than prefabricated metal beams, you know, that's why these buildings are so incredible, and others have had horrible disasters like that. But don't be mistaken, there's a lot of wood in these buildings. You know, they're brick facades. As evidence of that, right here on this spot, look behind you at what is now Arms parking lot, or Arms Park. Until 1954, this was the site of Arms Textile. It was one of the manufacturing companies that came to the city after the bankruptcy of Amoskeag in 1936. A group of citizens got together and created an entity called Amoskeag Industries. They went to the bankruptcy court. I'm talking the mayor, the newspaper publisher, the guy from the public service company. They went to the bankruptcy judge and said, what can we do to acquire Amoskeag? We don't want these buildings to be sold off to foreign investors who might come in and strip out all the machinery and just leave the empty hulks. Well, the bankruptcy court judge said, gentlemen, and they were all men, the Amoskeag mills are worth $5 million, 1936. If you come up with $500,000 by Friday, I won't put it up on the bankruptcy auction block. And if you come back with the balance, $4.5 million the following Friday, you can have it. They made the $500,000 in a day, and in the next week they raised $4.5 million without ever leaving New Hampshire, and were able to buy up all the assets of the Millyard. And it was hard. You couldn't cherry pick the buildings you wanted. It was all or nothing. And at that time there were 75 buildings in this complex, so they purchased all 75 buildings and then set aside a year-long effort to recruit new businesses to come and set up shop in Amoskeag. With a ready labor force looking for jobs, all those people who'd worked at Amoskeag wanted work, so one by one these new companies started coming here. One of them was called Arms Textile. What they made is the shiny lining for men's sport coats. I don't have a sport coat on. So here at Arms Textile in 1954, they were working with imported goat hides from Pakistan. And in the process of working with the hides, they're scraping them off to get to the shiny skin. No one knew, but anthrax spores were released into the air. Anthrax is a deadly killer. It's invisible. It doesn't have any scent. 3 workers inhaled the anthrax into their lungs and died pretty horrific deaths from inhalation anthrax. So the federal government came in and said, stop everything, get out of here. So the building was shut down immediately. 3 other workers had cutaneous anthrax, burns from the spores. So the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, is in charge, shut down Arms Textile. And they shut it down for 23 years. It sat right here where we're standing, all along the face of the river. Nobody knew what to do. How do you deal with an invisible bacterial spore that can kill you in 3 days? The Army came in. They tried to do studies to see if they could develop anthrax vaccines. There may have been efforts to weaponize it as well, to use it as a weapon, but all we know is the Centers for Disease Control chained this place up for 23 years. Finally, when the urban renewal project was at its height, after they filled the canals, they had to address this skeleton in the Millyard. Imagine being the economic development director for this newly revitalized Millyard, trying to encourage businesses to come and open up here with that ready labor force, and you're driving on the new paved commercial street, and they say, what about that? No, you don't want that building. That's the Anthrax building. So it was a blight on the city of Manchester for 23 years. So come 1976 and 77, they decided to address it. This was a triangular complex here along the river, along by that building which used to be UNH Manchester. That's now part of Decca. And on the end, there was a cap running almost up to where Cotton Restaurant is now. That triangular centerpiece, they build an incinerator right in the middle of them all. And anything that would burn was burned on the site. They didn't want to take the chance of transporting anything away. There could be spores lingering on the wood or the lumber. So anything that could burn was incinerated right there. Then they came in with hazmat suits, spray guns with bleach, boiling water, and chemicals, sprayed every brick wall surface they could in an effort to try to kill any remaining anthrax spores. And then they started to demolish the building very, very slowly. Why? The notion of a plume going up in the air and a prevailing westerly wind carrying right over to my parents' house over that way was not a good thing. So they were demolished very slowly. And then what do you do with the bricks now? They were sprayed even after they were knocked down, and then they had to find places to put them. Some were buried right here. Others were buried at the southernmost point in the Millyard that used to be called Hobo Jungle. Anybody remember Hobo Jungle? Anybody know why it was called Hobo Jungle? That's where the trains would wait as they were coming into the Millyard during the textile days, even during the days when True Jones, the brother of Frank Jones, had the biggest brewery in southern New Hampshire right here in the Millyard. So the trains would wait outside, and they would come in the morning either to drop off raw cotton, to drop off beer kegs to be refilled, then they'd go back out. So the hobos would literally ride the rails. Just like a Willie Nelson song. They'd have the stick with the little kerchief tied together, and they would jump on the trains, go where they want to go. So that's where they said, let's build the bricks there, bury the bricks there. It was a notorious place from Manchester's past. Nobody thought that area would ever be developed because of the rail lines that was necessary. So the hobos would wait there, and when Mr. Jones's beer kegs would come in to be refilled, the hobos who lived in that area would go onto the wooden kegs with hatchets, chop the kegs open, and drink whatever was left in the dregs of the kegs. They called it scut, bad sour beer. And the hobos would drink it, and basically they would go berserk. Cops would be called to come down to break up riots in the hobo jungle, and they were epic battles. The hobos did not want to give up their turf or their scut. So I've written hilarious columns about what would ensue in hobo jungle. But after this now, let's bury the rest of Arms Textile over there in hobo jungle, which was fine for about 30 years until someone said, let's build a baseball stadium. I know we'll build it right where hobo jungle used to be. So I kid you not, before the first backhoe went in, somebody said, hey, wait a minute. We need to check this out and make sure. Anthrax spores don't die. They live into perpetuity. And so the CDC came, did all kinds of soil testing in the south end of the Millyard, and they found some nasty stuff because this was a manufacturing mecca. So there were heavy metals and oils and solvents that were in the soil, but they were able to clean it up enough and found no evidence of anthrax. So they built the stadium, and everything's hunky-dory. But every time I get a hot dog, I still think about it at the ballpark. Something we all need to keep in mind. So this became a focal point for parking in the Millyard. Again, the original industrial Millyard had no no mechanisms for automobiles because they did not exist. So now this became a focal point for parking for a new modern Millyard. It was an amazing renovation project, but not without its controversies, because when Manchester was going to undertake urban renewal, every community had to hire a consultant to come up with a plan. And in our case, we hired the Arthur D. Little Incorporated Company, and their first plan in 1962 said, the Millyard will never be of aesthetic benefit to the city and should be demolished in its entirety. That was the very bold 1962 recommendation, and it set people back on their heels. I'd love to tell you people still had warm, fuzzy memories of the Millyard back then, but they did not. That was only 30 years after Amoskegg's final bankruptcy, right? 1936 to 1962. So there were some people who said, yeah, damn it, that's what it deserves. Tear the whole thing down. Amoskeg screwed me, they screwed my family, get rid of all these buildings. And that was the prevailing wisdom for a time. But then other people started saying, wait a minute, look at these buildings. Look at the elements I was talking about, the tie rods and the incredible wood infrastructure in these buildings. These can be made suitable for manufacturing again. So this battle between preservationists and demolitionists raged for 5 years. Finally, in 1968, a woman named Ada Louise Huxtable she was an architecture critic for the New York Times. And in 1968, she wrote an impassioned essay about the crime of herbicide that was being committed in Manchester, New Hampshire. Not herbicide, not killing plants, killing a city. Why would you take a wrecking ball to the manifestation of the Industrial Revolution in America that exists in Manchester? The uniformity of design and the concept that this planned urban community would be of service for a century or more. And why do we prop up artificial history like Plymouth Plantation, Colonial Williamsburg? They don't exist anymore, yet we've manufactured a Disney World type replica of what it used to be. This is the real thing. I was 15 years old. My grandmother gave me a copy of the New York Times Magazine and said, you need to read this. Now, I was going to be a journalist, I knew that, but we didn't read the New York Times on the West Side when I was 15 years old. But she said, no, you need to read this. And it changed my world. I read the story about the incredible things that had taken place here in my hometown, and my perspective changed completely. We were benefited mightily by two people, a woman named Tamara Haraven and her husband Randolph Langenbach. They were historians, architectural historians, and they came to Manchester and interviewed people who had worked at Amoskeg and talked about the city within a city and the heritage that we have here in the community. And the book they produced was called Amoskeg, Life and Work in an American Factory City. And if you read it, there are still hard feelings evident in the tone of those workers who had spent their careers here. They felt betrayed by Amoskeg, but the switch had been flipped, and people's mindset about the mills were suddenly changing. The Courier Museum of Art did an amazing exhibit about the history of Amoskeg. It was the greatest exhibit they had ever done. More people attended that than ever before. That was in 1975. So now Arms Textile is coming down, the canals are being filled in, and people are looking at the Millyard in a completely different light now, even people who called Manchester home. And it wasn't until we, as a community, began to embrace our history, our legacy, that the notion of preserving these buildings became paramount for so many people. So from 75 buildings to 60, the efforts made by guys like, what's his name? Joe Nelson, came here leaving Robert Moses in New York. He worked on urban renewal in New York, and he had married a girl from Manchester when he was at Grenier Field in the Air Force, promised her he'd come back to Manchester at some point. So he came back to Manchester and wound up overseeing the revolution that was taking place in the Millyard. He fought with the railroad companies over property rights. He fought with public service over buying that property for the dam. And basically, Joe presided over the salvation of the Millyard. And some years ago, he died at 102, 2 years ago. He was hurrying to Belmont Hall for breakfast. Because when you have breakfast at Belmont Hall and it's your birthday, you only pay the difference between 100 and whatever your bill is. Well, Joe was 102. He was going to be paid 11 cents to eat breakfast. And Joe was not one to pass up a bargain. But sadly, he was hurrying to his car to go to breakfast at Belmont Hall, and he slipped and fell and injured his hip, and you know how quickly people go when that happens. But on his 100th birthday, they had a celebration at Fratello's. And I was asked if I would provide a greeting for Joe. I was out of town and couldn't do it, so I made a phone greeting for him and said, if not for Joe, You wouldn't be celebrating at Fratello's. You'd be sitting on a curb by the corner of the road because there would be no Millyard if not for Joe. So I always celebrate him. I called him a giant in the Millyard. I took him to the Sea Science Center when I wrote a piece about him and asked him if he would pose with the Lego Millyard. And in it, I looked at the photograph and I said, he looks like a giant. You know what? He was. He was a giant in the Millyard, and much of what we enjoy to this day is because of the perseverance of a guy like Joe Nelson, whose daughter is Joan Porter. His son-in-law, Paul Porter, has been an alderman in Manchester, an assessor. So Joe was true to his word. He married, his wife took her home to New York and then brought her back here and helped save the city that we know today. So let's head down this way, if you would. We'll go to the access to the river. This river walk is 0.3 miles long. So it's not really a river walk. It might be a river stroll, but we have plans.
Was the steam tube that went under here, was it under the river?
Nope, sitting right on top of these.
It was sitting on top
Yep.
of this.
Yeah, we have a
And
great
so
photograph in the Millyard.
When the flood of 36 came through, did it just knock it all down?
Blew it all heading that way. Yep. And there were 2 large gas tanks that were stored here. Those were freed and they slammed into the granite strip branch, which made it unsafe. And so the city was literally cut. My father was a horse farmer, and they were using semaphore flags.
Do you speak French?
This is the statue for Ralph Baer. Ralph is a 60-year Manchester resident who is renowned as the inventor of the home video game. Ralph worked for Sanders Associates in Nashua, and he worked on simulator type technology, and he had this vision that he could use a television set to play games, to shop. Before the Home Shopping Network, Ralph had an image. He had a rifle with an infrared signal so he could shoot targets on the television set, and his first commercial application for that was the Magnavox Odyssey home video game. The Simon game with the buttons and the music, that was Ralph's invention as well. Teddy Ruxpin, you all remember some of these toys. He lived up on Mayflower Drive in North Manchester. I used to go visit him. And the Smithsonian in Washington has recreated his basement lab in Washington. And it is eerie because when you walk in, it even has his cardigan sweater on the back of the chair when I used to go visit him. I lived about 3 blocks away. So this is him playing with one of the first controllers on that video game, and we unveiled this in May of this year. Something that we raised $68,000 to build the statue and install this plaza, all of it in recognition of a guy whose technologies are actually being embraced in the Millyard today. It's all about biotechnology and engineering. So Ralph Baer was a visionary in his own way, and this was a great way for us to honor him. So when you take a selfie with Ralph, which we encourage, you get the beautiful mills in the background, so you see new technologies and old technologies coming together. So this is what we do in our free time.
Where is it in Washington?
At the Smithsonian in Washington.
Do you
So
know which one?
I don't.
No.
I've been in it, but I don't recall which one it was. But it's science and technology.
Yeah.
So when we unveiled this, we had a party at the museum, and we had 2 guys from the Smithsonian in the museum. It was terrifying. As a museum director, I've got guys from the Smithsonian. It's like pitching to Cool Day. So I use the term Manchester Connects. I mentioned that's an all-volunteer group here in Manchester. And our mission basically is to do things for the city that the city won't do for itself. Like a parent-teacher organization at a school. You know, the city will pay for books. Well, the PTO ideally will pay for field trips and other things. So among other things, recently, the beautiful colored furniture and the picnic tables you saw here, that was all put in by Manchester Connects. We got a $19,000 grant from AARP. Yes, I'm a card-carrying member of AARP. Anybody else? Anybody? Anybody? Okay. Which is why we enjoy history, because we've lived through so much of it. So that's just a way to revitalize Arms Park and bring more people to the river. Because, you know, the river served us in so many ways, as a source of food, as a source of commerce, as a source of industry, that, you know, the notion of using the river for recreation is something that we need to embrace more. John talked about kayaking. There used to be a world-class kayak course here on the river, but one of the floods about 15 years ago, unfortunately, all the infrastructure for the gates and other things was torn out by that flooding, which was nothing like 1936, but it was enough to destroy, you know, what had become a pretty good reason to come to Arms Park. I'm sure some of you may remember Riverfest. that annual celebration of the river that lasted about 15 years. So we just kind of, it lost its freshness, it lost its energy, and it went away. So we're trying to bring more activities here. One of our objectives in the past year was to do a pop-up beer garden on Thursday and Friday nights in the summer, under the bridge, where there's a beautiful grass area we could have set up there. We have all these great local craft brewers who wanted to help us. We ran into some arguments with the city and the river, but people want it to happen. So I'm hoping next year that's the kind of thing we can bring to the community to get people more engaged. Some of you... No, that was through Manchester Connects, but you know, I serve in a volunteer capacity with them. But yeah, we all have some good ideas. Among them, another pedestrian bridge, because that iconic pedestrian bridge we lost is something that's really missing. We have the hands across the Merrimack much further to the south, but why not something that connects from here? So the vision we have, and it's a very expensive vision, is for the bridge to go right from where the Ralph Baer statue is across the river again to Foundry Street. And so when you cross, people from CMC can come have lunch at Cotton, and vice versa. You can go across that way. So that's our vision. One of the difficulties with that very ambitious plan, in 1936, there was no Everett Turnpike. So you didn't have to worry about crossing the river at a high angle. Federal law requires that you be 22 feet above the riverbed for anything that passes over a highway. So it would have to be 22 feet above that, and the grade for the ADA, for disability, can't exceed 7 degrees. So to get 22 feet up there from here, luckily we have some really smart engineers working with us on that project. So there are switchback things you can do and other technology. So ideally, you know, within 20 years there will be an iconic pedestrian bridge here to get you across the Merrimack River. So we're always looking for new ways to make Manchester a better city. I mentioned the Mill Girl Plaza. That is the gateway to the Millyard. And I serve on the downtown committee for the Chamber of Commerce. I'm the chair. And what they asked me to do is help connect the Millyard with downtown. And that sounds simple, except we spent 150 years deliberately keeping them apart. The Millyard was built to be separate from the city. So when you want to go up, say Stark Street to go to Elm Street for lunch, it's an 8-minute walk. You have to cross Canal Street, which is like crossing the Daytona 500. You have to come out of the woods at Stark Street between the trees and make sure the light is going to let you cross. You have to cross the railroad tracks, which are not handicapped accessible. And once you get across the tracks, as you come to the Mill Girl Plaza, there are stairs. If you have a baby carriage or you're in a wheelchair, you simply can't do it. So that's something we think we can do with the city that will make the Millyard more accessible, more walkable, more visitor friendly. So keep in mind that as much as we celebrate the history of the Millyard, we're also very concerned with the future of the Millyard. And since I said future, let's go see what our friend Dean Kamen's been up to lately. We're going to cross the park and head over to the stairs that go right up by Cotton. How many people remember the old Notre Dame Bridge?
Oh, yes.
How many people were here to watch it come down? I was one of the photographers assigned to the demolition in 1989. And I did not like my assignment because I was asked to be on this side of the river. I'm still a West Side boy at heart. I thought I was on the wrong side of the river, and I always had this terror I wouldn't be able to get home. I managed.
When did Riverfest? Do you remember what year?
They brought it back in a very diluted fashion about 10 years ago, and it just didn't take traction. A guy named Earl Rinker, who was an executive counselor and radio executive, was really the genius behind it through the Junior Chamber of Commerce and other groups like that. And when he left, it kind of died on the vine. A couple of things I want to talk to you since we're here at this vantage point. If you look behind us to the lofts at Mill West, you see the sign on the upper right. That building was Mill Number 11. That was the flag factory. Amistad had a building dedicated to the manufacture of American flags. And I'm guessing you've all seen the 1914 photo of the Great Flag, which they produced to demonstrate their prowess. Well, 2 years ago, my friends at Brady Sullivan had created a flag of the same dimensions as the one that was made in 1914. And they wanted to celebrate Manchester's industrial past by displaying a similar photo in a similar fashion. So the original flag was actually displayed on the other side of the building. So we had some liberty with the history. some latitude. And so the Brady Sullivan folks asked me if I would talk about the history of the original flag on the day when they unveiled it. Now I'll tell you this, they called me and said, we want to do this on the 4th of July. Can you help us? Can the Historic Association be a part? Absolutely, but I don't think you should do it on the 4th of July because everybody goes out of town and not so many people are going to see it. So why don't you do it on Flag Day? And they said, what's Flag Day?
June 14th?
And I said, it's good that you called me. So we arranged for it to happen on June 14th, which was a Thursday, and they decided that they would leave the flag out on display for the entire long weekend. It was spectacular. The day came up, it was a beautiful sunny day, and the original plan was that the flag would be displayed fully draped, as it was in the photo from 1914. Arthur Sullivan wanted to do better. So he went to his friends at the sign company and said, no, we want to unfurl the flag. So we want it to be all curled up and then let down. And very tricky. It was a little bit breezy that day. The flag is heavier than you think. So they had to have guide ropes that they could grab as the flag unfurled. And the fear was it would just go blow away and land on the dam somewhere. But the guys from the sign company, Scott Alberton, did an amazing job of controlling it. Once it came down, it was tied down in a place, and it became a showcase for the city for a long weekend. I can't tell you how many selfies were taken that weekend, people going behind the building, and of course it was great publicity for their residential property, and the apartments are spectacular. But that was such a great day for us to replicate that moment from Manchester's past and make it something that people could appreciate in the present. And we were also lucky because many talented photographers saw that, and we have iconic images that we have in the Millyard Museum gift shop now, and the photographers donated us the rights to their photos. One, my friend Bob Lepre from the Union Leader took with a drone. That's really cool. I've got a version of it in my office. We had about 300 people there for the unveiling. And when I finished my remarks about the history of the flag, Arthur Sullivan called me back to the podium and he gave me a check for $10,000 for the museum. So they are huge supporters of ours. They actually are sponsoring our presidential primary exhibit right now. So the folks at Brady Sullivan truly appreciate the history and legacy of what we have here in the Millyard. So that was a great display of that. Now, as we're standing here, I mentioned the Notre Dame Bridge, and you all, in your minds, can you picture that graceful arc green bridge? Well, there was a lot of history behind that before it came down in 1989. In fact, after the flood of 1936, there was no bridge, so there was no way for the French-Canadian mill workers to come across the river to work here at Amoskeag. So they had to go all the way up to the Amoskeag Bridge by the dam, or all the way down to the Queen City Bridge to come across to work. So there was a big battle over how can we expedite the reconstruction of that bridge. Well, that time, 1936, there was a big Senate election going on here in New Hampshire. Senator Stiles Bridges, as not a senator yet, was running against John L. Sullivan, who was a publisher of the Union Leader and former Secretary of the Navy. So it was a very pitched public election battle, and they didn't just invent dirty tricks in politics. It existed back then. So Senator Bridges, ironic choice of name, wanted to win Manchester. He wanted to win the Franco-American vote, and that could carry the city for you. So his election committee leaked out word that John L. Sullivan was said to have been overheard talking about the fact that there was no bridge and no way for the French-Canadian mill workers to come across the river to work in the mills. And it's alleged that John L. Sullivan said, "Tell the frogs they can hop across the river." I can say that today, right?
Yeah. Well, being a frog, I've heard that more than once.
And that rumor spread and gathered strength and gathered momentum. And on election day, Senator Bridges won Manchester, and he won the 3 West Side wards at the time. And it's believed that that political sabotage is the reason that Stiles Bridges became a senator for 30 some odd years, having won that first election in 1936. Sometimes the legend's more fun than the fact. So we generally share both, but with the caveat that that's what people say. We can't be sure. So that's part of our legacy right there. So, awesome.
John, for someone who didn't grow up here, so this is where the Notre Dame Bridge roughly
Yes.
was. Where did it end on this side? Did it go all the way up to Elm?
No, it didn't end far after the Rivermark. It had a very long concourse. So if you look at old postcards of it, you'll see the concourse would have started before the Stark Mill. That's the Stark Mill right there. So yeah, the bridge, part of it was a lot shorter than you think. But again, it was built in 1936, and it became a very important symbol for the Franco-American population. You know, if you called it the Bridge Street Bridge on the west side, you'd get a dirty look. No, it's the Notre Dame Bridge, or Notre Dame, because that was a big part of the heritage of the Franco-Americans on the west side, which we all came to understand, whether you were German or Belgian or Franco-American or Irish. So, a big part of it.
Why was it replaced? What was wrong with it?
It was 2 lanes, 1 lane going each way, and they simply didn't feel that with the revitalized Millyard and so much vehicular traffic coming here, it wasn't big enough to accommodate it. So, as usual, there was a big hue and cry about saving it, but unfortunately, Dean Kamen, who led a big part of that charge, came too late to the game. What he envisioned and talked about doing was moving the bridge downriver to the pedestrian bridge stanchions and just basically reestablishing it there. His vision, it would be like the bridges in Florence, like the Ponte Vecchio. It would have shops on the bridge, and it would be a pedestrian bridge for the same use they had before the flood. But again, he came late to the game. People questioned the engineering efficacy of doing that, and so the basic bottom line was they just said, it's too late, we can't do that. And so they decided to take it down. And then they cut it up into pieces and sold them. My daughter has a piece. It was her favorite bridge. It was my least favorite bridge. Does anybody recall driving across as a kid? And you would look out the window, and it was basically egg crate. So when you look down, you could see the river. Now, as a 12-year-old riding my bike to go to the State Theater, I'm going on the sidewalk. I'm looking down and I'm seeing the river. No law of physics is going to convince me that this is safe for me. So, but that was, again, part of growing up in Manchester was that trip across that bridge. So this became 4 lanes, 2 lanes each way, far more efficient mover of traffic, but far less elegance and grace. And we need more elegance and grace in Manchester. So,
What year was that again?
1989. And we have books in the museum, Manchester Memories, depicting that, and rapid sequence photos. It was something, and it was not pleasant to watch.
Makes it great fireworks, that stuff.
It did. No, the original one did too, because you had the superstructure. That was almost like the Queensland Bridge in Australia. Really beautiful. So, yeah.
Do you know what happened to the old flag? I've Googled it many times.
I do not.
Okay.
And it's not for lack of looking.
Yeah.
After September 11th, when everybody wanted to fly an American flag from their car, from their home, I wrote a piece about that original great flag. And in the end, it was made for the Marshall Fields department store in Chicago. Marshall Fields is on the Miracle Mile in the city, and they had an 8-story atrium on the street side of their new building, and that flag was created by MSK to specifically hang in that spot. It was a 48-star flag, and again, we have the photo in the museum of all the workers lining the windows and lining the base of it, proudly standing with their work. And one of the beautiful things about that is not a week goes by when someone doesn't come into the museum and point out their grandmother or grandfather in the photograph. In fact, Clara Monier, well-known local political figure, was in yesterday, and she showed me her grandmother in that photograph. So I called Marshall Fields to find out what happened. Marshall Fields actually has a store historian. That's what an institution it is. And he did not know what happened to it. His best guess, and I hate those, was that when we went to 50 stars, it was destroyed in keeping with flag protocol, which is a really lame excuse, because go to the State House in New Hampshire and visit the Hall of Flags and see how many historic flags have been preserved through centuries. And why would someone have destroyed that flag thinking they were in keeping with some flag protocol?
He owned property in Peterborough. I used to live in Peterborough for a while, and I think Marshall Field had a property there.
Did he? Yeah.
That's all I like to think it's going on somewhere.
Well, I just so you know, I'm still looking. I'm still finding. It's a unicorn hunt, I know, but I'm going to find that one clue that tells me where it wound up and get it back here.
Yeah.
I think the folks at Brady Sullivan would help me in that endeavor.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's move on.
What's the origin of the town of Clayton?
It's a generally accepted title for a city that is the largest city in the state, but not the state capital. So in our case, Concord is just much smaller.
We met the guy that owns the park right there where the restaurant used to be.
Irving, yeah. Irving Muscat.
Winnipesaukee.
Irwin Muscat.
We went to his place.
I've been up there
on
a few
boat
times.
tour. No. I mean,
Up there?
he owns an island.
Yes, I know that, yeah.
Well, not the whole island. But
No, but I did a story for New Hampshire
did you?
Magazine
Yeah.
about the mansion. So we stopped here for a couple of reasons. Number one, to see the newest building that's going up in the Millyard. This is going to be a 3 by Hilton with parking for 127 cars. And more people care about the parking than they do about the hotel. Because parking is at such a premium here in Manchester that anytime you want to propose any kind of development in Millyard, it has to be a zero-sum game for parking. There can be no net loss of parking. So they are going to replace everything they're taking up with that footprint. Now this is important because this is the first actual building to go up in the Millyard since 1915. Now we can split hairs. The SNHU parking garage, for example, is actually south of the contiguous Millyard if you look at the original diagrams. So that doesn't count, nor does the Doubletree, whatever the hotel is, Hilton Garden Inn. So that's technically not in the Millyard. Prior to this one starting to go up, the last real building in the Millyard was what we call the bag mill. That's 540/560 Commercial Street. And there was a building on that site, but it was made out of wood. And Amoskeag wanted this unified vision of this complete community with all red brick buildings. So the bag mill was functioning while it was being demolished. They started tearing it down at one end and kept moving all the production to one end as the bricks started going up, and then eventually they flip-flopped, started working out of the brick end until they completed the entire mill at 540/560 Commercial. Now Dean came and just acquired that building because he's bringing more and more people to come and live and work in the Millyard. So he got a special dispensation from the city to put 29 residential apartments in that building with a couple of very serious caveats. You could not own a car. You cannot rent one of his spaces there if you own a car, because we don't want more cars in the Millyard. Also, he made a plea to the city that these would be millennials who were not going to have impact on the schools because they're not going to have kids. I don't know how you enforce that over time, but that was part of the vision that he went to the city. So he got several tax abatements because of the reasons it will be low impact on the city, and he expressed the urgent need to get more people to come and live and work here. What's old is new again. It's almost like it's 1840. We need people to come and live and work here. I hear and I read that we're getting older. Clearly not me, but it must be the rest of you. And so the urgent need to bring in a younger workforce is paramount. And so among the things that Dean can provide is housing here in the Millyard. So we have this millennial workforce that, you know, they use the Zagster bicycles, they use Uber, they use Lyft. They don't need to own a car. And that's part of the economic impact that Dean's new venture is going to be having here. So we're going to walk literally half a block.
Is this going to be red brick?
No, I'm not happy with the design. Nobody asked me.
How many floors?
10? I want to say 10. Yeah.
They just started?
Yeah. Yes, they're just getting
How'd
started.
they get away with that in the Millyard?
Don't talk to him. Did you hear him the first
I'm
time?
behind you,
The
John.
Heritage Commission has complete. So this is the future of the Millyard. I know it looks very unassuming. It looks like a regular old door, but you see those words and letters on the side of the building. ARMI, A-R-M-I, stands for the Advanced Regenerative Manufacturing Institute. About 2 years ago, Dean came to see me at the museum and said, I've been asked to come down to Washington. They want to talk about a project with me, but I need to visit with you and talk about how Manchester became the largest textile manufacturing city in the world, because we're going to start manufacturing new stuff. Dean calls, I answer, come on over. So he came with his partner Maureen Toohey, who I adore. She's his patent attorney, among other things. And so I gave him a 2-hour tour of the museum and talked about, you know, Amoskeag's planned vision for this, which he knows. He owns 10 mill buildings here, and he's invested millions of dollars in this area. So when he came back with $280 million in federal grants to create the Advanced Regenerative Manufacturing Institute. Their mission is within 20 years to manufacture blood, tissue, and human organs for transplant into living human beings. So, last 2 years, he's gone out and hired some pretty amazing people. The first hire was Dr. Richard McFarland, who was the former director of the United States Food and Drug Administration, who was a dues-paying member of the Millyard Museum. First visit he made was to come see me. Dean said, go see John, and so we got him. So Army and Decca, Dean Kamen and Associates, are now corporate partners of us with the Millyard Museum. So they pay for a special membership. So all these new people who are coming to Manchester will come to the museum with the hope of making them understand the legacy of this place where they're going to work. It's not just a collection of red brick buildings. When Riverstone came here to the Millyard some 15 years ago, they bought the top floor of the Wambach mill building and they invested a fortune in it. But that was not their plan. When they came to New Hampshire, they liked the tax climate. It's an insurance resettlement business that could be located anywhere in the world. And they wanted to come to New Hampshire. So they flew into Boston, bad move, drove up the Everett Turnpike, went by Manchester. They were looking in Concord and West Lebanon, up in the valley. And they didn't find products, they had properties that they liked, so they said, let's just go back. So they were driving back to Boston, October afternoon, just about 4 o'clock, when the light is hitting the Millyard just right, that orange glow. And as they're driving by Manchester, somebody looked over and goes, what the hell is that? Within 2 years, they'd moved their entire operation here to the Millyard. And they were operating in a pretty successful business fashion, again, beautifully redecorated. And after a couple of years, they said, there's something going on here. We can't put our finger on it. What's happening? So they approached me at the newspaper to see if I would write a column about a venture they were undertaking. Like we're talking about on the west side of Manchester, they wanted to see if the Millyard could be made a kind of a historic district, not just a building, but the whole Millyard. And so they made this application to this large federal group, and in explaining their rationale, I got them to try to talk about why they felt that way. And they said, you know, we came here, it was beautiful space, and we understand that, but we came to feel there's something more here. And the way I express it is there's a spirit of industry that still burns in this place. And at the Millyard Museum, we're the keeper of the flame of that spirit. Riverstone felt that, and they won that designation for the entire Millyard back in 2006. So they came to recognize what Dean wants his people to feel, that when you're here, you're part of a larger whole. There's something about Manchester, about this Millyard, that resonates down through the ages. So recognize that that's part of our mission, is to keep that spirit alive, and also to be teachers for the young people who come here, so they will appreciate and understand what this place has been for over 150 years before us. So keep an eye out. They do a quarterly summit every 3 months. They bring together some of the finest biological minds in the world, and they come to Manchester and they meet here. They make presentations on the progress they may have been making on DNA printing or 3D technologies that they may be able to use to create these human organs, ultimately for transplantation into human beings. Right now, the most sophisticated prosthetic limbs in the world are being made here in the Millyard. Our good friend Matt Albuquerque at Next Step Bionics and Prosthetics was the honorary chair for our preservation awards. And when you go there and see the products they're making, the ways in which they work, the intuitive ways in which people who've never had arms can use these prosthetic limbs to do something as simple as opening a bottle of water, brings tears to their eyes. And to know that that's happening here, world-changing inventions are coming out of the Millyard today as they were 150 years ago. So we'll go see some of them now.
Just a reminder that I have membership forms if anyone's interested.
I'll get them at the end.
Just raise your hand.
I'll make sure Paul gets on camera.
That's not funny.
I know. Well, you're short enough, you'll be okay.
Just like the one in back, they got them all.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Yeah. So here we are in the foyer of the headquarters of Decca. If you haven't figured out the lettering yet, that stands for Dean Kamen, D-E-K-A, where you're about to see some of the most incredible inventions that Dean has produced over the course of the last 30 years. This place is not normally open on Saturdays, but I told them how special you were. Sure. And how many of you are going to become members, that it would be great if you could open the museum for us. So basically, Dean's company has renovated this space into a mini museum of its own. Some of his most amazing inventions are here. I'll be happy to walk you around and talk about some of them, many of which are rooted right here in Manchester. Among them, obviously the Segway is something that was more hype than reality, but some of the technologies he used in the Segway have figured prominently in some of his inventions since then. The Slingshot water purification device could eliminate waterborne diseases in the third world. And that is because he made a deal with the devil, Coca-Cola, to help him distribute, I kid you not, to help him distribute these water purification devices called the Slingshot. So Donna's going to let us in. Please be respectful of the items. Don't ride the Segway. Okay? Don't try to pour soda out of the dispensing machine, and we'll get to see some of Dean's best work. I'm a mill worker. I tell everybody that.
stayed 2 weeks at Chicopee, that was it.
No, my mom and dad worked at Wambach, and my grandfather worked at MSK, so I have that. So these are among Dean's more recent inventions, many of which you'll know by reputation, if not by actually seeing them. One of his first, while he was still in college, pardon me, at Worcester Polytech Institute, Dean invented a portable dialysis unit that completely revolutionized the way in which people receive dialysis care. Many, many years ago, I worked at what was then Nashua Memorial Hospital, now Southern New Hampshire Medical Center, and we had a dialysis unit. And the dialysis unit consisted of 4 lazy boy chairs, each of which was connected to a machine about the size of a full refrigerator. And the poor souls who had to come in for dialysis care would spend 4 hours sitting in that chair, reading a magazine, watching a television, while their blood was cleansed through that dialysis process. Dean invented a device small enough to fit in a briefcase. And that is the source of his great good fortune, economically speaking, but also it was one of the most revolutionary medical devices at the time. So you can now do your dialysis sitting at home in your own easy chair, and that was the launch pad for what became an amazing career. He dropped out of college. I didn't get to drop out of college. I had to finish. My parents made me see it through. But because he had so many ideas he wanted to bring to the world, that was the best way for him to do so. You've all heard of the Segway. It's the Segway HT. HT stands for Human Transporter. And this was the subject of such intense media interest before it was released that it had all kinds of code names. It was Ginger for one point, and so people would not know what it was about. And when it came out, people were underwhelmed because it's like, that's it? But the technologies, the gyroscopic technologies and balancing technologies in this have been applied to so many of his other inventions, including the robotic wheelchair, which can literally climb stairs, can raise you up to shake someone's hand and look them in the eye, even though you're in a wheelchair. When you go to Dean's home in Bedford, the house is full of antique wheelchairs because he has a fascination with that kind of mobility. So the Segway was a big part of that. And you probably know that the company was purchased by a British firm, and that the guy who bought the company rode his Segway off a cliff. I'm not kidding. I wanted to see if anybody knew that. True fact.
By accident?
I hope so.
What a way to go.
This is the Slingshot water purification device that I mentioned to you. Through all series of filters and osmosis, you can put the most foul liquid you could imagine in here, and it will come up with potable water. He actually demonstrated this at the White House with Bill Clinton when it was first revealed. And the technologies are so advanced that he had less problem making the machine than getting it where it needed to go, because these devices are needed in the most remote and inhospitable places in the world. If there's an earthquake in Haiti, for example, the need for fresh water is staggering because of the possible horrors of waterborne disease. So how do you get these to those places? Dean and his people knew the best distribution network in the world is Coca-Cola. You can get a Coca-Cola anywhere in the world. And so he went to Coca-Cola and said, if you will agree to distribute these products for us, my engineers will revolutionize the way in which you dispense soda. So has anybody been to Burger King lately, or McDonald's?
Yeah.
And you see these beautiful sleek machines with the spray of buttons. And I tend to drink, when I drink soda, Diet Dr. Pepper, cherry flavored, and I would push those 3 buttons. And then you get the ice coming out of here, and then you hit dispense. And that soda is poured in its perfect form as you want it, with no cross-contamination whatsoever. So the next person who goes after me, maybe you like Fanta Orange. Well, you press your buttons, and Fanta Orange with no cross-contamination. So that was what Dean's engineers did for Coca-Cola in return for them distributing the Slingshots. The colors should be readily apparent to you. So Coca-Cola plus Decca equals Slingshot. There's a fascinating YouTube video of Dean and Slingshot, and I highly recommend you watch it to know and understand that this was invented here in Manchester. So we are still coming up with technologies that are world-changing. We did an exhibit at the museum about 2 years ago on the history of public health in Manchester. And we had some pretty amazing stuff. I mean, Manchester's been very progressive, including the nurses in the schools. They don't work for the school department, they work for the health department. So we've always had these very revolutionary ideas. So we put together this exhibit, and sadly, the last item in the exhibit was a Narcan dispenser. Because the opioid crisis is so much a part of our lives in Manchester that we had the Narcan dispenser, we had safe station brochures, and that ticked me off. I hated ending such a great exhibit on what I felt was a negative note. So on the night we opened the exhibit, Dean walked in the museum. He was trying to go upstairs. He was looking for the mayor, and he thought he might be in the museum. I saw him. I beelined across the room to Dean. Can we get a slingshot? Why? Because I want to end this exhibit on a positive note about health here in Manchester, and this is going to be game-changing. All right, called Julie in the morning. I called Julie in the morning. Now we're going to get a slingshot brought to the museum. Look at the sophistication of this device. I expected it would be flown in by helicopter, you know, a black helicopter, so it was secret, and they would lower it, you know, rappelling guys down and bring it in. No. Little four-wheel dolly, pushed it the length of Commercial Street and knocked on the door. It said, here's your slingshot. It's like, I was expecting a little sexier presentation. But we installed it at the museum, and people came to understand the value of this device and just the vision that Dean and his people bring to this community. If you look out the window, you might see him landing his helicopter on the building next door. You'll see the orange windsock. That's how he gauges whether or not it's safe to land on a given day. And think about that. I'm gonna go to work now. And he wheels his collapsible helicopter out of the garage on a hand dolly, opens it up, and then flies to work. So we're blessed to have him here. Again, take a look around. There's some other machinery here you may or may not recognize. I mentioned the Luke prosthetic arm. I know you're all fans of Star Wars, so you know why it's called Luke. Luke Skywalker having lost a hand in a sword fight with Darth Vader. But these machines are so incredibly intuitive in the ways in which, you know, the men and women coming back from combat zones are able to live full normal lives because of these technologies that are being created here in Millyard. The first competition was at Memorial High School, three city high schools, and I got to cover it. Last year, the Georgia Dome was not big enough to host the national competition in the U.S. first.
We don't have it online now.
You can generally find them all online now. If you
Yeah, I mean, they're
Google them.
A little thing,
Yeah.
but I can't
The,
just put in Decca and it's.
Decca Research and Development. It's a time clock.
It's just a town clock.
It's to punch in. Oh, you punch in. We don't punch in, obviously, but really, I'm shocked. When people look at the cards, it was to punch in.
So this is an infrequent opportunity. So we are in the Wambach mill right now, which has been renovated, obviously, and it's owned by the Brady Sullivan Properties folks. The variety of tenants is astounding. So we're just going to go up and go through a couple of floors just so you can see how they've restored the building, some of the beautiful modernized staircases they have, but also some of the antique staircases where you see that ambuscade painted on the riser of every single stair. Those are steel manufacturer or iron manufacturer that Ambuscade wanted, part of that continuity of design, but also branding. You cannot walk through this building and go up those stairs without knowing that you're in an Ambuscade manufacturing building. So there's no real tour, just enjoy the views, and we'll walk through. critical life lines. Yeah, that was the only way to get stuff in.
So they're more than.
No, no. You can see the marks on the floors where the heavy equipment would have been dragged around when the mills were being emptied. That speaks character as much as anything else. You can see the oils and solvents that may have seeped into the floors over a century of use as textile mills.
After this kind of close your eyes.
And pull your shoulders in, they're so narrow. Well, we had more games than all the way up there. But we still had the cheese holes. No, we had 10 or 12 years ago. We had pretty bad flooding. We go to a certain conservation. Yeah, this is our museum right here. They filled this in. So that, yeah, that's weird. So you see here this So you see when they finally started burning coal to generate steam power, they still use water power, but they augmented it with steam. That original vision of this industrial utopia was sincere and heartfelt. So when they finally started burning coal, they built the chimneys to 10 stories high. So the prevailing winds, again, would sweep any ash and soot away from the city. I don't think it helped me growing up on the west side, but you know, for anybody who lived on this side of the river, you would have avoided the pollution and squalor that they saw in British industrial cities they wanted not to replicate. So that, again, was part of their adherence to their original pledge and vision for this industrial utopia. So this is the west side of the river right here.
When did the
Is
chimney
that one
come
still
down?
there?
They came down, no, all those huge chimneys came down in the early 1960s. It was early parts of the industrial, the urban renewal that we talked about, but those at that point were probably becoming more of a health hazard as much as anything else, because you know they'd been out in the elements for 60 years. And these are certainly not reinforced in the way the mill buildings themselves are. So the notion of an earthquake, which we do get here, might have been enough to say, let's get these down now. And over here, you see the construction of the buildings, all being done with human labor. And all these bricks are going to go up here, and these are all coming in from Hooksett on a daily basis. They would take them on barges down the river from the clay beds in Hooksett, where they would be fired and then brought here to Manchester to bring them in. So basically this construction, you all remember the 7 basic tools, right? The wheel, the lever, the pulley, the screw, the inclined plane. All of those components were brought into play here as they worked to build these buildings. So as the course of bricks goes up, here is where the tie rod would be hammered into the floor. Then the bricks would go up, and then that cap would be threaded onto them. So that was part of the process that you're seeing unfold here. Again, this is probably in the 1840s, and look at how they make use of the ingenuity that was available to them in that day. It would go up a lot faster today than it did then. These are all hods for cement and masonry and bricks, still all laid out here, ready to go. And again, 8 million bricks in the Jefferson Mill alone. So somebody had some gnarly hands by the end of the day.
So the windows went up first?
Well, the framing did, yeah. That was, yeah, you had to get the framing in to build around the brickwork, so. And think about the granite that was carved for all of these buildings, not just the foundation, but every single window sill and every window cap at the same time. And the windows were made this big on purpose because, again, beginning in 1831, there was no artificial illumination. So you had to get as much available light as you could, natural light, because with the air full of cotton fibers, you can't be walking around with a lantern with a flame in it because the fire danger was simply too great. So they depended upon whatever natural light they could bring into the buildings to make the workers able to see to do their jobs.
So mills would not run at night?
No, they did not run second shifts because they simply didn't have the light to do so. They might have wanted to, but until electricity came into play, that wasn't an option for them. So all here.
In the summer, they had longer shifts?
Yes, they did, to take advantage of the light. We didn't have daylight savings time then, but it didn't matter. You know, our days get shorter simply by proximity of the sun. So yeah, they'd be more productive in the summer. Maybe not more productive because it would be hotter in the mills. One of the things they had to maintain was high humidity because when you're working with those shuttles, the shuttle that goes back and forth, when you make thread, you get threads going that way, that's called the warp, and this one is called the weft. Weft is a derivation of the word weave. To do the weft, you had to use the mechanical shuttle that would go back and forth. And there's a bobbin on the shuttle that dispenses the thread as it goes back and forth on the loom. When that thread snapped, that shuttle became a projectile firing across the room. So one way to mitigate the danger of that happening was to keep the humidity high so the thread stayed moist so it was less likely to break and become a lethal projectile firing across the room. All of which you can see displayed to perfection at the Millyard Museum. If I can squeeze a plug in there. Gail York did ask me one more time to remind you about membership. Membership for a year for a senior entitles you to unlimited visits to the Millyard Museum. If you're a member of the museum, you also get free visitation at the Sea Science Center throughout the year. You get discounts in our gift shop. You get advanced notification of these fabulous walking tours, plus our book talks and author signings, like we just did on the history of Manchester's shoe industry with Kelly Kilcrease and Yvette Ladowski. So, not saying it's mandatory, but
I guess OSHA wasn't around for those 3 days.
OSHA was not around for anything back then. Ear protection, when you hear that one shuttle running in the Millyard and multiply that times 800, you get a sense of the din in which you would have been working. Again, the air full of cotton fiber, people weren't wearing masks, so versions of COPD. My grandfather contracted tuberculosis, perhaps because of his time in the mills, so OSHA's a good thing.
Not to mention all the kids that was working.
And the
in
kids,
those.
yeah, there was child labor, and again, you cannot dispute the fact that Amoskegg's business model depended upon them doing business with southern plantations, in which point the cotton was being harvested by slaves in the American South up to the Civil War. But we did our part for the Civil War. Amoskeag was so nimble and so adept at creating new products that after President Lincoln visited Manchester in 1860, he saw their capability. So when ultimately the Civil War did break out, Amoskeag had seen it coming and stockpiled more than 3 million pounds of cotton. But still, by 1863, they were running out of raw material. So the request from Washington is, can you make rifles for the Union Army? So Amoskeag transitioned into the manufacture of Springfield rifles. They made more than 27,000 rifles between 1863 and 1865. That's just the Springfield model. They made shotguns and carbines as well, all of which required their engineers to go to Springfield, Mass. to copy all of the metal templates. Everything had to be interchangeable, a Springfield rifle and an Amoskeag-made Springfield rifle. So think of the technologies there. If you worked at Amoskeag making rifles, you were exempt from the Union Army draft. So there was no shortage of men who wanted to volunteer at Amoskeag making rifles. And again, it just shows how proficient they were. And if you're going to manufacture rifles, you have to test fire them. You cannot take a factory-made rifle and send it out to the front lines. So Amoskeag reached a deal with the city of Manchester, at which point the rifles would be test fired at the stroke of every hour. So when the bell rang 1 in the Jefferson Clock Tower, you would hear a fusillade of weapons firing all at the same time, on ranges into safe targets, and it would happen again at 2, and at 3, and at 4. Wow. So they didn't want the, I guess, the symbol of total anarchy in the city of Manchester with rifle shots going off willy-nilly. So it was all carefully orchestrated. So.
Would you say the date of that picture was?
I didn't say, but I would guess it to be around 1844 to 48 when they were building, our mill number 3 was built in 1844. And the way I know is I look at the background and how many mills are in the background for them to start that second row.
So it does have the curved top windows that I asked
yes,
you about
yes.
earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah, and you can see the raw frames out here too, not actually installed yet. So. And Dean Kamen has replicated all of that too, every detail. So I'm not going to try to gather you again at the museum. You are welcome to go to the museum. I'd love for you to go and see the presidential primary exhibit. We studied the impact of Manchester through the years on the primary because, let's face it, it's the New Hampshire presidential primary. Not in the last 2 weeks, it's not. It's the Manchester presidential primary. Everybody comes to Manchester. Nobody's riding dog sleds up in Colebrook when it comes time to vote. They're all here in town. So go appreciate how much we celebrate our role in the history of the primary here in Manchester and enjoy the rest of the museum. All of this will make a little more sense when you walk through the museum. Thank you all very much. Thank you.